The architect, Satoshi's secret past. He wrote in code what prophets wrote in scripture. The myth, the mind, the machine, by Satoshi Nakamorwell. Prelude virtue by design. There are systems that command obedience, and there are systems that make obedience the optimal path. John Nash did not believe in enforcing morality. He believed in designing it, coding it, embedding it deep within the logic of interaction. Not through laws, through incentives. He searched not for justice, but for balance. The kind that emerges when self-interest aligns with the collective good. He saw morality not as a virtue to be taught, but as a side effect of well-structured games. What others called conscience, he reduced to constraints. What others called chaos, he recognized as a field of influence waiting to be modeled. In his notebooks, game theory, differential geometry, monetary history. In his mind, a singular question: can we create a system that rewards integrity without requiring it? Bitcoin would one day answer that question. But long before its genesis block, Nash had glimpsed the blueprint. He studied not just equations, but empires. He followed not just theories, but treaties. Gold dissolved into paper. Currencies backed by nothing but war. Bankers above borders. Silences louder than speeches. And through it all, he searched for one thing: equilibrium. Not peace, not fairness, but the delicate state where no participant has anything to gain by defecting because the game itself enforces order. Tesla dreamed of energy. Aurelius dreamed of virtue. But Nash designed the rules that made virtue rational. He did not build an ideology. He seeded a structure that if copied would not need rulers, only players. And in that structure, morality would no longer be taught. It would be incentivized. Not by fear, not by force, but by design. Classified excerpts project. Architect File 47, declassified notes from John Nash's unpublished writings on game theory and morality. The stable strategy is not the most violent, nor the most righteous. It is the one that best preserves itself. Incentives shape behavior more consistently than law. Law speaks once. Incentives whisper forever. On currency and power, money is not a medium of exchange. It is a tool of memory, a weapon of coordination, and a mirror of trust. Every inflation event is a redefinition of truth, a lie wrapped in a ledger. A perfect currency is not one that enables freedom. It is one that cannot be repurposed for control. On cryptographic design, to decentralize is not to scatter. It is to encode trust into topology. The protocol must assume betrayal. That is its only path to incorruptibility. True consensus is not agreement. It is alignment in the presence of adversaries. The following account is a reconstruction. It is based on publicly available documents, private correspondences, recovered notebooks, digital archives, anonymous forum logs, and a series of stylometric analyses conducted between 2023 and 2025. While much of what follows cannot be verified by conventional means, the patterns within speak for themselves. John Forbes Nash Jr. was a mathematician, a Nobel laureate, a man diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was also, it seems, something else. There is no proof that John Nash authored the Bitcoin white paper under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, but in matters of systems, the absence of proof is not the absence of authorship. It is often the condition for survival. This book is not a biography. It is not a theory. It is not a work of fiction. It is a ledger of events some known, some hidden, and some deliberately erased. The reader is advised to proceed with care, not because what follows is dangerous, but because it is increasingly difficult to tell the difference between madness and foresight. M.R. 2025. Prelude Virtue by Design. Classified Excerpts Project. Architect File 47. Chapter 0. The River and the Bell. Chapter 1. A Beautiful Mind. Chapter 2. The Letter. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Mirror. Chapter 4. Ideal Money. Unseen Chains. Chapter 5. The Hidden System. Chapter 6. The Cipher Veil. Chapter 7. Gold and Blood. Chapter 8. The Protocol Without a Face. Chapter 9. The Ghost in the Chain. Chapter 10. The Crash. Again. Chapter 11. The Final Notebook. Epilogue. The Ledger. Beyond the Flesh. Chapter 0. The River and the Bell. Before the equations, before the whispers of madness or genius, there was a boy who climbed trees barefoot and counted stars like they were secrets meant just for him. John David Nash Jr. grew up in the quiet hills of Bluefield, West Virginia, a town stitched together by railways, kindness, and the soft weight of Sunday afternoons. He was a curious child, not yet eccentric, with a habit of asking why even after the answer had already been given. He spent his summers wandering along East River, the water moving slow and thoughtful like it was remembering something. One morning, while skipping rocks, he saw the surface shimmer in a way that made him pause, not from fear, but recognition, as if the river itself had blinked. He would later say it was the first time the world looked back. Not a hallucination, just a moment of awareness, a mirror in motion. His parents were proud of his mind, though unsure what to do with it. His father, an engineer with neat handwriting, encouraged diagrams. His mother gave him books older than she was, but it was Thomas Albright, a neighbor 3 years older, who captured Nash's imagination. Thomas was tall, confident, with a sunburnt grin, and a way of speaking like everything made sense if you just tilted your head right. He'd once let Nash tag along to fix a radio, and while rewiring the back panel, he said something that stuck. "You know, Johnny, wars ain't really just about flags. Sometimes it's about who prints the money behind them." Nash blinked. "Isn't that the government?" Thomas smiled but didn't answer. "You'll get it someday." It meant little to him then. Just one more riddle from someone older. But Nash looked up to him more than he'd admit. Thomas left for the war a few months later, proud and whistling. He wrote one postcard. "Don't let your brain get normal, Johnny. The world needs your weird." He never wrote again. The church bell rang the day the news came, a dull, long toll that made the birds stop singing. It was the first time Nash felt the silence of a town all at once. It was different from the hush of snow or sleep. It was the sound of loss becoming structure. He didn't cry. Not then. Instead, he started watching. He noticed how prices at the grocer changed every few weeks, even when the labels stayed the same. How people stopped fixing things and started making do. How the news seemed more interested in what wasn't said than what was. He remembered Thomas's words. though they still didn't make sense. He stopped asking as many questions, not because he had fewer, but because he'd begun to suspect some weren't allowed. And yet, Nash was still Nash. He sketched spirals in the margins of hymnals, memorized verses from Proverbs and Marcus Aurelius, asked his teacher why the golden rule was only ever written down, never enforced. By age 15, he'd begun mapping not just equations, but interactions, the reasons behind the reasons. He didn't call it game theory yet. To him, it was just why people do what they do when everyone's watching someone else. He hadn't yet discovered his equilibrium, but something in him had shifted. He still smiled, still laughed, still played marbles in the dust with schoolyard rules of his own invention. But behind those soft eyes, the pattern had begun. Chapter 1. A Beautiful Mind. The train to Princeton hummed like a forgotten machine trying to remember its purpose. John Nash sat alone in the second car, a folded acceptance letter tucked into his coat pocket, a sharpened pencil behind his ear. He hadn't spoken to anyone since Pittsburgh. He didn't need to. The letter had done the talking for him. This man is a genius. That was all the mathematics department required. The halls of Fine Hall welcomed him with the quiet arrogance of stone. Inside, the air smelled of chalk, old wool, and dusted off eternity. Nash walked its corridors, not like a student, but like a surveyor, as though measuring the curvature of some invisible boundary only he could see. He had no intention of learning from anyone. He had come to map the rules beneath the rules. Most people played the game. Nash studied it. He watched how professors corrected one another in subtle jabs, how students hoarded praise like currency, how the entire system was rigged not by malice, but by incentives no one could name. He would name them. At night, he sat alone in the basement library, flipping through books on number theory, game mechanics, and ancient philosophy. He became obsessed with symmetry not of shapes, but of systems. What made them stable? What made them collapse? He filled notebooks with equations and questions. What is trust without authority? Is morality the product of limited options? Can cooperation emerge from fear alone? He didn't just want to understand behavior. He wanted to predict it. When the faculty finally noticed him, it wasn't because he spoke up. It was because of what appeared on the blackboards long after everyone had gone home. Strange, sprawling equations about non-cooperative equilibria, drawn like frescoes on dark slate. One professor dismissed it as dense gibberish. Another said simply, "That's new." It was around this time that Nash began to write about money not as currency, but as code. He saw it differently than anyone else. Not as a tool, but as a language of control. Every coin was a vote. Every interest rate, a weapon. Every inflation curve, a sentence passed. He scribbled one night, "A perfect currency is not one that serves the state. It is one the state cannot touch." But the world beyond Princeton was already speaking louder than math. In 1948, Israel was declared a state. The British Empire fractured. Bretton Woods reshaped the financial map. The dollar was rising not as a currency, but as a global enforcement mechanism. Nash was young, but not blind. He kept seeing the same names, the same families, the same institutions, bankers shaping borders, economists drawing new nations, and through it all, silence. The kind of silence you find in well-kept vaults. He stopped talking to classmates. He stopped attending lectures. Instead, he wandered into topics no one at Princeton encouraged: monetary policy, early central banking, obscure treaties, Titanic passengers who never boarded, and silver-backed currencies that never returned. It wasn't research anymore. It was obsession. Even he didn't know what he was solving, only that something was unbalanced and waiting. One afternoon, a janitor found him asleep in Fine Hall's lowest corridor, face down on a stack of notes, chalk dust on his hands. Scribbled in the margin of a yellowing notebook was a single equation, and beneath it, control is the only constant. Equilibrium is the only escape. The janitor didn't understand it, but Nash would remember that line for the rest of his life. Chapter 2. The Letter. It was dated January 18, 1955, and it bore the quiet authority of genius made formal. Typed in monospaced black ink and sent to the National Security Agency, John Nash's letter offered something impossible. A new kind of encryption, derived not from keys or secrecy, but from the inherent difficulty of solving certain mathematical problems. He called it a sort of trapdoor function. They called it premature. To the few analysts who reviewed it, the letter was brilliant but paranoid, insightful but unusable. The mathematics were decades ahead. The language, however, was strange, like someone trying to speak in code even before one was needed. One line lingered. The problem of establishing a cipher, which is effectively unbreakable even by an agency that has access to all of the methods of attack, including secret ones, is not only desirable, but essential. They archived it. Quietly. What they didn't realize, Nash wasn't merely offering a cipher. He was warning them. That same year, Nash began seeing patterns not just in equations, but in events. He started talking, carefully, about money. Not as economics, but as power projection. He referenced the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the way it passed just before Christmas, how it reshaped the U.S. monetary system in the image of private banking interests. He mentioned the Balfour Declaration, not in terms of geopolitics, but in terms of debt for land exchange, a subtle but permanent shift in leverage. He wondered aloud, what if every world war was preceded by a new financial contract? At night, his notes turned to geometry again, but now, the figures warped. He scribbled paraboloids and partial differentials around names. J.P. Morgan, Paul Warburg, Rothschild, Keynes, Montague Norman. The equations weren't for analysis. They were for mapping control. How currency flowed. How war followed. How debt settled faster than peace ever could. One margin read, World War I ended gold. World War II ended sovereignty. The next war will end the idea of privacy. He tried again. Another letter. Not to the NSA this time, but to himself. A manifesto. One page. It was never sent, only folded and sealed into a Princeton library book. Money as we know it is the instrument of forgetting. It erases cost, masks power, and resets memory through inflation. A moral system must not forget. It must remember everything. He signed it with a symbol, not a name, a capital B, 2 vertical slashes. Years before the white paper, years before Satoshi, the idea had already begun to form, not a solution, but an escape, a cipher not of secrecy, but of sovereignty. Chapter 3. Cracks in the mirror. The morning of November 22, 1963. John Nash was writing on the floor of his study, not sitting, not pacing, lying flat, chest to carpet, surrounded by open books, graphs, and half-erased calculations. The television behind him buzzed through static. He wasn't listening, not consciously, but when the broadcaster's voice broke, so did the chalk in his hand. President Kennedy has been shot. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply whispered. Of course. That afternoon, he walked 6 miles through Princeton's winter light and back again, circling the campus like a planet tugged by unseen gravity. A student stopped him outside Fine Hall and asked if he was all right. Nash looked at him for a long time and asked quietly, if someone tried to change the system, really change it, how long would they live? The assassination of Kennedy didn't just shake Nash. It fractured something internal, not in the way a mind breaks, but in the way a pattern shatters across glass, revealing lines that were always there but previously invisible. He reread Kennedy's June 1963 executive order, EO 11110, the issuance of silver-backed certificates, a challenge to the central banks, a threat to the system Nash believed existed beneath every government. Then came the motorcade. Then came the Zapruder film. Then came silence. Nash began constructing models again, but not of games or markets. Now he was mapping decisions and deaths. Garfield challenged banking corruption. Assassinated. McKinley supported gold over fiat. Assassinated. Huey Long threatened centralized capital. Assassinated. Lincoln printed debt. Free greenbacks. Shot at the theater. Even Princess Diana appeared in his scrawl, not for policy, but for legacy. For narrative. For disrupting the myth of monarchy at the wrong time. He underlined it. Patterns of removal. Cleansed histories. The doctors called it a paranoid relapse. They adjusted his lithium. Recommended rest. But Nash no longer believed his mind was sick. He believed it was attuned painfully so to truths the rest of the world had agreed not to see. In one of his private journals, now lost to the archive, he wrote, "There are no coincidences in empire. There are only tolerances." During one hospitalization, he asked his physician a strange question. "Do you think death is a form of gravity?" The man smiled politely. Nash didn't. "Because I do. I think it bends decisions, time, even history, and some people figured out how to manufacture more of it." By 1965, Nash's behavior grew more erratic or more precise, depending on interpretation. He stopped discussing mathematics with anyone. Instead, he filled notebooks with layered diagrams, concentric rings of economic shocks, currency changes, military interventions, collapsed regimes, and always, a banker at the center. One sketch, later found among his effects, depicted a torus of war, trade, and money at the center. Not a nation, but a symbol. The hallucinations came after. Not voices, but visions. He saw a network, a pulsing chain of encrypted logic running parallel to history, a ledger immune to lies, a system that couldn't be corrupted because it couldn't be convinced. He didn't see it as salvation. He saw it as correction, a geometric answer to a moral imbalance. "I am not crazy," he whispered once to Alicia. "I am awake." And then he asked for more chalk. Chapter 4. Ideal money. Unseen chains. The term ideal money first appeared in one of Nash's published lectures in the early 2000s, but its origin was far older, scribbled decades earlier on the back of a library checkout slip, along with a crude drawing of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. A currency should not be based on belief. It should be based on refusal. In the late 1960s, Nash resumed work not as a professor, but as a specter. He moved silently through Fine Hall and the basement stacks of the Institute for Advanced Study, sometimes barefoot, always watching. By then, he no longer spoke often of theorems. He spoke, quietly, about cycles. Every fiat currency dies. Every debt spiral ends in war. But we never reset the rules. We just rewrite the debts. Students would laugh nervously. Others listened carefully. He began collecting graphs of historical inflation rates. Not from textbooks, but from classified reports. The Weimar Republic. Zimbabwe. The 1971 Nixon shock. Nash marked each with the same symbol. A broken equilibrium curve. A game whose rules had changed mid-play. One day, he placed a new note on a public chalkboard, written in his increasingly cryptic style. "When money is memoryless, trust becomes theater." He was building towards something. Behind the scenes, Nash was writing again. Not just theory, but design, using his deep understanding of non-cooperative equilibrium to model systems that couldn't be gamed. His early sketches contained elements now recognizable as Byzantine fault tolerance, time-based consensus, and transaction irreversibility. It was currency as geometry, where morality wasn't enforced, but emerged as the optimal strategy. This wasn't utopianism. It was engineering. An ideal money, he wrote, would behave like gold but without the blood. But gold had already been removed from the game. In 1971, Nash watched Nixon end convertibility. Bretton Woods collapsed. The petrodollar was borne back not by bullion, but by military assurances and oil contracts. Nash wrote furiously, "We have replaced substance with coercion. This is no longer a currency. It is a leash." He started connecting dots. Others had been trained not to see. Oil priced only in USD. Gaddafi proposing a gold dinar. Iraq preparing to shift oil contracts into euros. Collapse. Invasion. Assassination. One note simply read, "Value is the pretext. Control is the goal." It was here that Nash's notebooks took on a more spiritual tone, not religious, but mythic. He compared Bitcoin's hypothetical structure, though unnamed at the time, to scripture. A ledger without priests, a Bible without men. He quoted Marcus Aurelius. "What is not good for the beehive cannot be good for the bee," and scribbled beside it, "This is why the beekeepers always burn the hive." Nash began sleeping less, eating less. The only thing that grew was the shape of his idea. A system, a network, a consensus. not enforced by trust but by truth, made mathematically burdensome to betray, not a revolution, a correction. In 1976, while reviewing historical financial collapses, Nash drew a circle. Inside it, he wrote, "The chain must be unbroken. The memory must be permanent. The exit must be permissionless." He stood for a long time staring at it, then whispered, "Not ideal money, ideal memory." And for the first time, he smiled. Chapter 5. The Hidden System. Nash never trusted the news. He trusted numbers. In the margins of his notes, he often wrote historical dates like coordinates. 1913, 1933, 1944, 1971. Each was a move, a turn in the game, but not one played by democracies or armies. These were moves played by issuers, by those who created money itself. He began calling them the architects behind the architects. The year 1913 was circled in red in every one of Nash's timelines. The Federal Reserve Act passed days before Christmas, when most of Congress had gone home. He saw it not as a bureaucratic reform, but as a bloodless coup handover of the monetary controls of a republic to a network of unelected financiers. "A central bank is not a utility," he wrote. "It is a machine for privatizing decision-making." Then came 1933. Roosevelt outlawed private gold ownership. A nation confiscated its past. Then 1944. Bretton Woods. The dollar ascended as global reserve currency, backed by gold only in name and force in practice. Then 1971. The mask was removed. No more gold. Only belief. Only inertia. Faith-based finance, Nash scrawled. Backed by faith-based war. In a sealed notebook marked Anatomy of Control, Nash began sketching what he believed was the true shape of the world. Not a pyramid, but a loop. Debt. It dependency. It conflict. It consolidation. New debt. The same families at the center. The same corporations at the top. The same institutions laundering legitimacy through democracy. This is not capitalism. This is custodial feudalism. He began referencing names most economists avoided. Rothschild, Warburg, Rockefeller. Not as conspirators in the cinematic sense, but as long-term players in a game that everyone else kept forgetting existed. He wasn't alleging global control. He was alleging intergenerational incentives stabilized by invisibility. During one of his quieter years, Nash read that the Rothschild banking dynasty once controlled more wealth than all European monarchs combined. Escribbled. The trick is not owning the land. It's owning the ledger the land is recorded on. And below that, Bitcoin must be a ledger no one owns. Nash grew quieter in public, but increasingly active under aliases. He began frequenting early bulletin boards, anonymous listservs, and later, encrypted forums used by the emerging cypherpunk movement. Most of the time, he didn't speak. He watched, but he saw kindred minds not in politics, but in protocol. People who believed that trust was too valuable to outsource. People who saw privacy as a precondition for dignity. People who were not angry, only finished waiting. One of his final entries in Anatomy of Control was stark. They will not give back what they took, so we must build something they can't touch. He stared at the phrase for hours, then added underneath, a truth engine. A trust machine, not a weapon, not a flag, just a correction. And he began writing again, not in chalk this time, but in code. Chapter 6. The Cipher Veil. By the early 1990s, Nash had become something of a ghost on campus, tolerated, pitied, occasionally revered. He would shuffle through fine hall in mismatched clothes, sometimes speaking to no one for days, other times scrawling sudden brilliance on a forgotten chalkboard before vanishing again. But online, he was something else entirely. The internet was still young, unguarded, a wild scaffolding of anonymous rooms and open-source dreams. In that space, Nash shed his name. He became a presence, quiet, deliberate, deeply technical. Under pseudonyms, he joined cryptography listservs, contributed to obscure mathematical threads, and read everything, especially from the cypherpunks. Privacy is necessary for an open society in the electronic age. Read one manifesto. We cannot expect governments, corporations, or other large, faceless organizations to grant us privacy. To most, it was ideology. To Nash, it was systemic inevitability. He was not impressed by passion. He was impressed by structure. He reviewed dozens of white papers on digital cash, blind signatures, cryptographic proof. He dissected each like a mathematician reverse engineering a cathedral. Then, somewhere between 1997 and 2001, he began to write again, this time, with intention. What emerged was not a theory, but a blueprint. A peer-to-peer system of value that didn't require trust, because it removed the need for intermediaries altogether. It would require an immutable ledger, incentive, aligned, validation, decentralized consensus, mathematical scarcity. He called it, in private notes, a memory machine that cannot lie. But he hesitated. The world was not ready. The infrastructure didn't yet exist. The broadband was too slow, the public too placated, the petrodollar too secure. Worse still, surveillance had outpaced cryptography. Governments were waking up to the power of code. To release too early, he warned, is to give them time to react. To release too late is to fail the game. After 9/11, Nash watched the Patriot Act pass with mathematical speed. Overnight, privacy became suspicion. Cryptography became crime adjacent. Nash became silent again. He would wait. But the protocol was written, somewhere deep in an unindexed archive. Somewhere, not even he could access without multiple layers of authentication. The code slept. The idea didn't. One final post appeared under a now-deleted alias on a cypherpunk mirror site in 2005. It was unsigned, titled simply, "Incentives are Destiny." Only fragments remain. The goal is not secrecy. The goal is indifference. A system that does not need to trust is a system that cannot be coerced. Build the game where defection becomes unprofitable. There are no kings in consensus. The post was archived, reposted, and forgotten until 2008, when a white paper by a name no one recognized appeared in a cryptography mailing list. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Satoshi Nakamoto. Most readers shrugged. A few saw brilliance. One, somewhere in Princeton, read it in silence and smiled. Chapter 7. Gold and Blood. The year 2009 brought a strange calm. The housing crash had passed like a tidal wave, loud, televised, then quickly absorbed by the same system it nearly drowned. Banks were bailed out, bonuses returned, and the root cause remained untouched. A system built on debt, insured by ignorance. John Nash, now older, walked daily across Princeton's frozen campus, hands in his coat, eyes sharp despite the years. He no longer wrote publicly, but he observed ceaselessly. In private, he marked a pattern in the headlines. Saddam Hussein had proposed trading oil for euros. Muammar Gaddafi called for a pan-African currency backed by gold. Both were removed violently. Nash made no accusation. He made diagrams. Oil, currency, sovereignty, war. Every time a leader attempts to exit the petrodollar system, their country is bombed or their body disappears. To others, this was conspiracy. To Nash, it was game theory. He mapped historical interventions as moves in a larger optimization problem. Each invasion followed a rejection of debt-based settlement. Each collapse benefited a network of institutions rather than nations. The IMF, the World Bank, NATO, SWIFT. He did not see organizations. He saw consensus protocols enforced through coercion. In a spiral notebook, Nash compared the global financial system to Byzantine fault-tolerant networks, but with a twist. Imagine a system where defectors are not ignored, but eliminated. He drew the outline of a block. Not a building block, but a data structure. In our current game, he wrote, truth is punished. Obedience is incentivized. Ideal money must reverse this polarity. When Gaddafi's convoy was bombed, Nash wrote nothing. But later that night, he opened his encrypted drive and made a single entry, another note erased. By this point, Nash had begun to treat Bitcoin not as his creation, but as his descendant. It was behaving as designed. It punished betrayal through difficulty. It rewarded participation without favoritism. It required no ruler. It could not forget. There must be blood, he had once scribbled, referencing the old monetary orders. But it no longer needs to be human blood. To Nash, the stakes were spiritual, not religious, but metaphysical. He saw in Bitcoin a kind of digital stoicism system that behaved with reason, could not lie, and enforced honesty through entropy. Like Marcus Aurelius with code, he wrote beside a quote from the Meditations, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one, and underlined it. What if we built a system that could only reward such men? In 2011, when reporters asked Nash what he thought of cryptocurrency, he smiled. It's mathematically interesting, he said, then walked away. Chapter 8. The Protocol. Without a face. By the time the world noticed Bitcoin, it was already too late to stop it. The first block had been mined on January 3, 2009. Embedded within it was a message. The Times 3, Jan. 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. To most, it was a timestamp. To Nash, it was a warning, a monument, a mirror. The code does not beg, it remembers. As Bitcoin grew, the question of who created it dominated forums and financial pages alike. Satoshi Nakamoto was a pseudonym, an absence, a myth in motion. Nash said nothing, not in public, not to his wife, not even in the journals he left behind. But his earlier notes, long ignored, began to rhyme with the structure of the protocol. Dimestampet consensus. Non-cooperative equilibrium mechanics, trustless verification, mathematically enforced scarcity. These were not afterthoughts. They were the DNA of the system, and Nash had spoken of them decades before anyone else. Some dismissed the link. Nash was old. He had no coding history, they claimed. But in quiet corners of Princeton, a rumor persisted that in the late 70s and early 80s, Nash had spent entire nights in the computer labs learning C, experimenting with encryption, testing prototypes of what he called resistant logic, not to prove anything, just to see if it could be done. You only have to be fluent once, he once told a colleague. Then you teach the machine to speak for you. Nash began to retreat further, not into madness, but into invisibility. He walked daily with Alicia. He smiled more. But behind the calm was a precision few could detect. He no longer corrected people. He no longer needed to. Bitcoin was no longer a theory. It was an unfolding. A few attempted to claim Satoshi's identity. Most were laughed off. Some were silenced, quietly intimidated, discredited, disappeared. But the real Satoshi never spoke again. In 2013, a printout of the Bitcoin white paper was found in Nash's study. Its margins were marked with faint notes in pencil. Most were formulas. A few were comments. One read, this solves nothing, but it allows others to begin. Another read, it cannot be reversed. Good. And finally, scrawled in the bottom right corner, you were never meant to trust me, only the code. That year, Bitcoin surpassed 1-0 for the first time. The world called it a bubble, a scam, a threat. Nash called it inevitable, and the game changed. Chapter 9. The Ghost in the Chain. The price surged, then crashed, then surged again. Banks dismissed it, then studied it, then began filing patents. Governments issued warnings, then licenses, then laws. But the protocol did not flinch. Bitcoin doesn't care if you believe in it, Nash once whispered. It only cares if you lie. By 2014, Nash had become a quiet oracle. He was invited to conferences again, given awards, praised as a recovered genius, proof that schizophrenia could be overcome. But the audiences never heard the whole mind. They heard equations. They missed the warnings. In a rare private meeting at a university symposium, a young cryptography student asked Nash what he thought of blockchain. Nash paused, smiled, then said, the chain is only honest because no one can own it. The student laughed, unsure if it was a joke. Nash didn't. We don't need another revolution, he added. We need a protocol that survives them. Behind the curtain of his public re-emergence, Nash was watching something deeper. He monitored Git commits to the Bitcoin Core repository. He read proposals on Lightning, Schnorr signatures, and privacy layers. He knew what others didn't say aloud, that this system would either remain permissionless or be absorbed and neutered, like every other rebellion. He told Alicia one evening. They will try to domesticate it, to brand it, but you can't negotiate with math. You can only fork it. Somewhere in his home, among layers of papers and folded diagrams, Nash kept an envelope sealed with wax. On it, written in his old ciphered shorthand, was a phrase only a handful would ever decode. True decentralization begins when the author disappears. In May 2015, John and Alicia boarded a taxi to Newark Airport. They were heading home after receiving the Abel Prize of Final Accolade, decades delayed. They never arrived. The car spun. The road split. The world lost them both in a flash of twisted metal. Accident, said the headlines. No foul play, said the police. But Maya Reyes, Nash's former student, by then a researcher in cryptographic systems, received a package 3 weeks later. No return address, just a flash drive. Inside, a folder titled Mirror Game, dozens of C++ files, a ledger, and a note. There is no master key, only the next question. At the bottom, a symbol, a capital B, 2 vertical slashes. Bitcoin continued. Blocks ticked forward. Consensus remained. And somewhere inside the chain beneath the hash, behind the math, the ghost endured. Chapter 10. The Crash. Again, there were no monuments, no plaques, no coins etched with his name. The man who may have engineered the most disruptive system since Gutenberg died without ceremony, his final legacy reduced to headlines about a car crash on the New Jersey Turnpike. Nobel laureate, game theory pioneer, dies with wife in taxi accident. The obituaries celebrated a beautiful mind, not the one he used to build Bitcoin, the one the world found easier to understand. For the public, the crash was tragic. For Maya Reyes, it was suspicious. The driver survived. His story changed twice. No toxicology, no follow-up, no autopsy made public. The Nash's bags were never recovered from the wreckage. One of the last things Alicia reportedly said to a nurse at the Oslo ceremony was, "He's finally at peace. The system works now." Reyes dove back into Nash's notebooks, the unindexed ones. Scribbled in symbolic code, they read like prophetic diaries of a man trying to stay sane while modeling madness. One margin note, dated April 2015. The code is live. The chain holds. Another read, "I no longer need to protect it. It protects itself." As Bitcoin crossed 500 again that summer, and forums resumed the search for Satoshi, Reyes stayed silent. But in her lab, she began a different experiment. She compiled early Bitcoin commits, cross-referenced syntax structures, spacing habits, comment phrasing. She compared them to Nash's personal C++ notes, the ones kept offline, unknown to all but her. The overlap was not definitive, but it was impossible to ignore. Variable naming patterns, unusual logic structures, a tendency to write as if speaking to the future. She consulted a stylometrist in Vienna, under a pseudonym. The expert ran the code through 3 independent models. 2 returned inconclusive. 1 returned a probability. Nash, 96.4% confidence. Reyes asked if this could be forged. Not unless they had access to his personal notebooks, the expert said. Or his brain. She did not publish the results. She did not tell her colleagues. She simply printed the analysis and placed it in a safety deposit box with a handwritten note on top. He wanted to disappear. Let him. By winter, Bitcoin had begun its long ascent again. Nations debated regulation. Corporations filed for custody rights. The same institutions Nash once mapped as predators now sought to become validators. But it was too late. The code had already spread. In an encrypted email to herself, Reyes wrote, "It is a strange thing to inherit a ghost, especially one that speaks in blocks, not words." She closed the email, disconnected her terminal, and stepped outside into the snow. Chapter 11. The final notebook. The notebook was wrapped in wax paper, sealed inside a hollowed-out copy of Gödel, Escher, Bach, tucked between dusty volumes in the deepest row of the Fine Hall archives. Only Maya Reyes knew to look there. It wasn't labeled, but it hummed with the pressure of unsaid things. The pages were unlike Nash's other work, not the tight matrices or neat derivatives of his academic mind, nor the spidery paranoia of his breakdown years. This was different, a blend of precise notation, cryptographic musings, mythic fragments, and silence. Long, empty spaces, as if some equations could only be solved by waiting. The first page bore only one line. No system is truly decentralized until its author is irrelevant. Then, on the next, a sketch of the Genesis block, the Times headline. A hash, a signature. Beneath it, lightly penciled. Memory is now immortal. Let them lie. The chain will not. What followed was a mixture of philosophical reflections and technical sketchism that appeared to suggest future updates Nash had imagined but never implemented. Time-locked morality contracts. Zero-knowledge consensus layers. A distributed court with no judges-only verification. Next to these were names: Tesla, Turing, Marcus Aurelius, and then a line, circled in black. Bitcoin is not the new gold. It is the new scripture. Reyes paused there. The comparison wasn't metaphorical. In Nash's mind, the blockchain had become a gospel of incorruptibility, a Bible without priests, a truth without interpreters. He had modeled its emergence not on finance, but on revelation. One diagram stood out, a spiraling helix labeled Truth Entropy Curve. It mapped trust, power, and chaos over time. At its center was the event horizon, the moment when no institution can reverse the chain, and below that, at that point, all lies become debts, unpaid. The final page contained no math, only one last scrawl, barely legible. My name does not matter, but equilibrium does. Then a drawn line, a capital B, 2 vertical slashes, and the notebook ended. Maya Reyes closed the cover. For a long moment, she simply breathed. Outside, somewhere, another block was being mined. Another hash formed. Another node whispered truth into the network. And John Nash remained where he had always wanted to be. Nowhere, everywhere, unowned, unburdened, unbroken. Epilogue. The ledger beyond the flesh. Years passed. Governments collapsed. Others hardened. Surveillance grew smarter. more polite. Central banks rolled out their CBDCs with sleek interfaces and soothing words. Convenience, inclusion, stability. But beneath the gloss, the chain still ticked forward quietly, autonomously, incorruptibly, a trustless witness, a protocol without apology. Maya Reyes never published her findings. Instead, she taught. She traveled quietly offering guest lectures under pseudonyms, speaking in parables, citing no names. She called Bitcoin the memory of our disobedience, and the blockchain a graveyard where false kings go to die. Most didn't understand. That was the point. One evening, at a small university in Eastern Europe, a student asked her, half joking, "Do you really think Nash was Satoshi?" She smiled. The way Nash once had. He was many things, but mostly, he was early. Then she opened her laptop and projected the Genesis block, the timestamp, the message, the silence beneath it. He understood the game, so he stopped playing. Back in Princeton, a new generation of students passed through Fine Hall. Most never noticed the scratches on the chalkboard in the lowest corridor. The cleaners couldn't scrub them out. Maintenance gave up. They read, "Control is the only constant. Equilibrium is the only escape." No one remembered who wrote it, but the block explorer was still running, and the chain was still true.